The first way that I just want to talk to us for a moment about brain development is to talk about the fact that the brain, different areas and regions of the brain develop on different timetables. So we know from 0 to 3 initiatives and so forth, there's tremendous growth in very young children in the brain. But what is news to some folks is that growth continues in different ways throughout adolescence and actually well into young adulthood. So it's helpful, I think, for us to think about two types of changes. One are structural changes, the actual physicality of the brain. And the second are functional changes, which is the way that the brain works. So if I was to use an analogy of a car, then the structural changes, right, would be like the bodily integrity of the car. Is it sound? Is there rust? How does that work? But the bodily integrity of the car tells us really not much at all about fuel efficiency, about whether the electrical system and so forth is working. So that's the functional aspect of the brain, right? We can talk about how the pieces change, and then we can talk about how what the pieces do change over time. And so I'm going to talk briefly about two sets of systems that respond to that function. One is the socio-emotional system, and one's the cognitive control system. They aren't literally systems in the brain, but it's a helpful way to think about how these different pieces of the brain come together for the different activities and tasks that we have. So when we talk about the structural changes in the brain, here's my movie, no popcorn. This is talking about gray matter development. So there's gray matter and white matter in the brain, and what we see is that some of these structural changes are actually continuing well into adolescence and potentially somewhat into young adulthood. So we're talking about a couple of different aspects of structure and function that are happening. We can also talk about the fact that the different parts of the brain that are involved in tasks like making decisions or thinking ahead and so forth, that throughout adolescence, one of the big tasks is for these different parts of the brain to talk to each other in a more efficient way. So if I continue my lame car analogy, and now I'll talk about a highway, what we see with this increased connectivity between regions is where you could imagine the electrical impulses that move throughout the brain, that they're initially traveling on a dirt road to a street in a neighborhood all the way up to a superhighway. The analogy only goes so far, but the idea is there are changes in the structure and the connectivity that not only connect those parts of the brain better together so that they can communicate, but it's more quick and efficient in the way that they do that. So those things are all coming together during adolescence, particularly for the frontal lobe of the brain, and that's normal development. So that's what every adolescent brain on average is doing during that time. Let me switch just briefly then, as we have a sense that the physicality of the brain is changing during that time, to talk about the two systems that have probably the most relevance for the topics we're talking about today, the socio-emotional system and the cognitive control system. The socio-emotional system, those parts of the brain that talk to each other, are responsible for processing emotions, social information, reward and punishment, right? So as I'm seeing information from you about paying attention and interest and so forth, like I do in class, right? My socio-emotional system can be processing that. And in terms of normative development, this system undergoes major changes in early adolescence that we're increasingly confirming relate to the hormonal changes of puberty, right? So when we talk early adolescence, we're talking 11, 12, sometimes as young as 10, moving up to 13. So if we can think about these parts of the brain coming online and talking to each other, what does that result in? Well, that results in pretty much, if we were going to describe a typical teenager, what is up here? Increased sensation seeking, taking risks and seeking out risks, right? That's a normal part of adolescence. Increased or easier emotional arousal. So we can talk about this as emotional lability, right? Moving from very high to very low. So in my own household, this goes from you're the best mom ever to you're the worst mom ever, cycling, depending on the day, it could be seconds or minutes or something like that, right? But this easily aroused, right? And this, and then increased attentiveness to social information, right? We talk about paying attention to peers and thinking about what other people are thinking and so forth. All of this is really, in a sense, kind of activating or coming together and maturing for young adolescents. So we have all of this happening. The second system that we're interested in, though, is the cognitive control system. And here's where we're talking about some of the characteristics that we don't usually think about as describing early adolescence. Deliberative thinking, right? Planning ahead. If you hear the terms self-regulation, if you hear the terms executive function, right? We talk about this frontal lobe that develops last out of all the parts of the brain as like the CEO of the brain, right? This is the way that we regulate and control our thoughts and our behavior. This develops gradually from pre-adolescence well into the mid-20s, and probably beyond the mid-20s, some of our research will suggest. Those changes in those parts of the brain result in better impulse control, so not following every impulse, even that we have it, better emotion regulation, so some of that lability and high and low can be regulated, more ability to think about the future, right? If this will happen, this might happen, then this might happen, which is a real challenge for our young and mid-teenagers and some of our older teens as well. And better reasoning, right? Being able to take other people's perspective and so forth. So if we put those two things together, okay, then we have what Larry Steinberg and Beth and I and everybody that was on the MacArthur Network describe as this immaturity gap, right? So we were able to look at the development of those cognitive factors and those psychosocial factors at the same time in the same kids. And what we realized and what we were able to document, that while cognitive capacity, right, assessed being working memory, verbal fluency, and so forth, reaches adult levels around age 16, our psychosocial development continues to mature well into early adulthood. So some have described this situation or this gap like, I'm continuing the car analogy, I don't know why, I took the train today, starting the engines without a skilled driver, right? That the adolescents have got all the emotions and all that kind of action and activity and interest, but yet those self-regulation capacities are yet to be fully developed. And again, the thing I want to emphasize is that's normal, right? That's the normative development. In a sense, that's what adolescents are supposed to be doing during this time. So this gap that we see, while we're plotting it here on average, this gap is essentially the task of adolescence into young adulthood, is to develop and mature in a way that's going to close that gap as they grow into their 20s and their mid-20s. So what does it all mean? Well, to speak in broad terms about adolescence, brain and behavior development, right? We've got a socio-emotional system that's easily aroused, highly sensitive to social feedback. We know that peers are incredibly and appropriately important to teens. We know that adolescence is still a time characterized by an immature cognitive control system. The ability to regulate is still developing and not fully developing. As a result, adolescents are adolescents, less able to control those impulses, less able to resist peer pressure, less likely to think ahead, more driven by the thrill of rewards. And even though I just showed you in 3 minutes, there's actually a whole lot of research underpinning this that helps us understand that it's not only the behavior that we're seeing, but that there are brain structural and functional changes that help us understand why those behavior changes are happening. So with all of that as a background and as a pivot as Marcia will be coming up and so forth, I do want to help us try to take that development, right? So take that developing brain, that developing adolescent, and think about the environments in which they are developing. So if we're thinking about behavior and development as a function of both the person and the environment, when we begin to describe and measure correctional facilities and adult correctional facilities in particular and adult systems as an environment in which adolescents, a portion of adolescents essentially are growing up, I think it's fairly easy to see how those environments are not going to create not even optimal, but good circumstances in which all of this brain and behavior development can be happening. And we know from other types of research that youth incarcerated in adult facilities, as Krista mentioned, particular risk for negative outcomes, right? The research suggests that there are negative outcomes on recidivism, right? So it exacerbates recidivism, makes kids will recidivate faster and more often when processed through the adult system compared to the juvenile system. So adolescence is simply a time of incredible development. And as we think about youth that are in the adult system and in adult facilities, we can, I think, really become concerned about the impact of those facilities and those surroundings on this normative developmental process for these youth. Okay, great, thanks.